August 1944. See then prisoners escape a Nazi prison camp where no one has ever made it out alive. Freedom is only moments away. The mountains are ahead, the resistance is waiting, and for Australian soldier Ralph Churchill, the war should be over. But instead of running, he stops. In his pocket is a photograph of his wife with 4 words written on the back: "Come home to me." Behind him, more than 100 starving prisoners remain trapped behind barbed wire. And in that instant, Ralph makes a decision so unbelievable, it sounds fictional. He turns around and goes back into the prison camp he just escaped. What happened next became the largest successful prisoner of war breakout of World War II, larger than the Great Escape and far deadlier in its risks. Yet, almost no one knows the story. This is the forgotten true story of the man who escaped the Nazis, then willingly returned to save everyone else. August 1944. In Nazi-occupied Slovenia, 7 Allied prisoners crouched in darkness just beyond the barbed wire of a German prison camp where no prisoner had ever escaped and survived until that night. Among them stood Australian soldier Ralph Churchill, a young man from Adelaide who should have been running toward freedom, but instead froze and stared back at the prison camp behind him. In his pocket was a worn photograph of his wife with the words, "Come home to me," written on the back. And as he looked at the watchtowers and fences behind him, he thought of the more than 100 starving Allied prisoners still trapped inside. In that moment, Ralph made a decision almost impossible to believe. He turned around and went back into the prison camp he had just escaped from. That decision would lead to one of the greatest and most successful prisoner of war escapes of the Second World War, an operation larger than the famous Great Escape and far more successful, yet almost forgotten by history. Ralph's story had begun years earlier in 1941 during the Allied retreat from Greece, when German forces overwhelmed Allied troops, and Ralph, then a young Australian soldier, found himself stranded on a beach with 6 other men after the last evacuation ship disappeared into the distance. Desperate to avoid capture, the men found a broken fishing boat, patched its leaking hull with scraps of cloth and tar, and launched into the sea under cover of darkness, hoping to row hundreds of kilometers to safety on Crete. For days, they survived by drinking rainwater and eating raw fish, rowing by night and hiding by day. But just as hope began to rise, a German patrol boat intercepted them and captured them before they reached freedom. Ralph and the others were packed into cattle wagons and transported across Europe in horrific conditions, with almost no water, no room to sit, and dead prisoners thrown from the train during the journey. When they finally arrived at Stalag 18D in occupied Slovenia, Ralph entered a brutal world of starvation, disease, and forced labor, where prisoners spent every day repairing bombed railway lines while surviving on tiny bread rations, barely enough to keep a man alive. Even worse than his own suffering was the sight of Soviet prisoners in a neighboring compound being deliberately starved to death by the Germans, collapsing one by one into the mud as Ralph watched helplessly. Knowing that waiting for liberation meant death, Ralph decided his only chance to survive was to become useful. Gifted with languages, he secretly taught himself German by bribing a local delivery boy to smuggle newspapers into the camp and studying them at night in secret. Within months, Ralph spoke German fluently enough to impress the camp authorities, who appointed him official interpreter and prisoner spokesman, a role that gave him access to records, guards, and movement outside the camp. While the Germans believed they had gained a cooperative translator, Ralph was quietly building an underground escape network. He met a newly captured New Zealander named Freddie Russell, who had fought alongside Yugoslav partisans before capture and knew secret escape routes through the mountains, partisan safe houses, and the location of a hidden airstrip where Allied aircraft could evacuate escapees. Realizing that escaping alone was suicide, but escaping with help might work. Ralph spent months using his position as interpreter to secretly contact local resistance fighters, blacksmiths, farmers, and priests who agreed to help create a chain of safe houses stretching from the prison camp to partisan territory. By August 1944, the network was ready. Ralph selected 6 men for the first escape and led them through cut barbed wire into the night. They successfully reached partisan lines, but when the resistance fighters urged Ralph to continue to freedom, he shocked them all by refusing. Knowing over 100 men remained behind, he said he could not leave them and voluntarily returned to the camp before dawn, crawling back through the fence and slipping into his barracks without detection. Back inside, Ralph began organizing the greatest POW breakout of the war. He secretly divided prisoners into groups, distributed forged documents and civilian clothes, assigned departure times, and coordinated with partisans waiting outside the camp. In October 1944, the operation began. Group after group slipped through cut fences and drainage culverts into the forest, while Ralph manipulated camp records to hide their disappearance. By the time German officers realized prisoners were missing, nearly 100 men had vanished. Furious guards launched massive searches, but Ralph adapted instantly, using alternate escape routes and leading the remaining prisoners out before the Germans could fully lock down the camp. In total, 105 escaped prisoners began the long journey across nearly 250 kilometers of enemy territory through the Slovenian mountains in winter. Guided by Yugoslav partisans, the men marched through blizzards, freezing rivers, and mountain passes while hunted by German patrols. Many were already weakened by years of starvation, and the journey pushed them beyond human limits. Ralph personally forced exhausted men to keep moving, knowing anyone who stopped would freeze to death. When some collapsed, others carried them. 3 men died during the crossing, 1 from exhaustion, 1 in a fall, and 1 from pneumonia. But the rest pressed on through snow, hunger, and constant danger. Finally, after weeks of marching, the survivors reached a hidden partisan airstrip where Allied Dakota transport planes waited in a mountain meadow. Ralph counted his men. 102 survivors had made it. Exhausted, starved, and barely able to stand, they boarded the aircraft and flew to safety in Italy. There, Allied officers were stunned by what they saw. Gaunt prisoners in rags who had somehow crossed enemy territory and survived. But instead of public celebration, Ralph was ordered to keep the operation secret because the partisan escape network was still active and revealing details could cost countless lives. He signed the secrecy papers and returned home to Australia in silence, weighing barely more than 50 kilograms. Though awarded the British Empire Medal, he received little public recognition and resumed a quiet civilian life, rarely speaking of what he had done. Years later, while the world celebrated the 1944 Great Escape in books and films, Ralph watched as history ignored his far larger and more successful operation, one that freed more men and brought vastly more home alive. Only decades later, after secrecy restrictions were lifted, did his story finally emerge. Today, the route Ralph Churchill led his men through the Slovenian mountains is known as the Crow's Flight, named after his camp nickname, and hikers still follow the path he once walked through snow and enemy territory. Ralph Churchill never returned to the camp for fame, medals, or glory. He returned because he could not abandon the men still behind the wire. And because of that choice, more than 100 families received husbands, fathers, and sons home alive instead of telegrams announcing their deaths. History may have forgotten his name for many years, but Ralph Churchill achieved something extraordinary. He escaped hell, walked back into it by choice, and then led over 100 men out alive. And so, we come to the end of the extraordinary story of Australian soldier Ralph Churchill. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share our channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon so you never miss more amazing stories from history. Thank you for watching.